What do you need?
Nine-year-old mother of three huddled inside her home in a small rural village, unsure what to do. Her country's president had been killed 6 days earlier when his plane was shot down. And violent chaos had broken out, first in the capital city, and then it spread to the countryside. As houses burned around her, she took her children and fled with many of her neighbors to a school on a nearby hilltop, hoping they would be safe there. But evil was headed their way. Soon the school was surrounded by mobs of people, armed with clubs, sticks, and machetes. Police stood by and watched as the killings began. Similar scenes played out around the country for nearly 3 months. Unspeakable crimes committed by militia groups, soldiers, and neighbors against neighbors. And during that time, the international community largely remained on the sidelines. I'm Kathy Kinzora, and this is History of the 90s, a podcast about a decade that changed the world. On this episode, the Rwandan genocide. Like most conflicts, the Rwandan genocide did not happen in a vacuum. The underlying issues that preceded the 100-day massacre existed for many years. They were complicated and involved various actors with competing interests. And like most conflicts, in the end, it was the country's innocent citizens who were caught in the middle of what became a violent, unspeakable atrocity. Rwanda is a small country in Central Africa, known as the Land of a Thousand Hills, because of its beautiful green rolling landscape. For centuries, the people of Rwanda lived in peace, even though they descended from two different tribes. Hutus and Tutsis often intermingled and intermarried. Historically, Hutus farmed crops, while Tutsis tended livestock. It was a division based on class that was somewhat fluid, but gradually that division became ethnic designations. Because cattle were more valuable than crops, the minority Tutsis, who made up about 14% of the population, became the country's elite class.
The monarchy in Rwanda historically was a Tutsi institution. They did govern. They were the overlords of the Hutu peasant class.
That's Alan Thompson, head of Carleton University's journalism program and former international affairs reporter for the Toronto Star newspaper. He says the division between Hutus and Tutsis was made worse in 1918 when Rwanda became a colony of Belgium following World War I.
And the Belgian colonizers played on that and exaggerated those differences and used it to their advantage to colonize and control the country.
In a strategic decision, the Belgians favored the minority Tutsis, giving them privileges and Western-style education. In return, the Tutsis ruled the country on their behalf. The Belgians also propagated theories that Tutsis were more intelligent and more refined than Hutus. And in 1926, the Belgians introduced ethnic identity cards used to separate the two tribes. By the end of the 1950s, the Hutu majority, which made up 85% of the population, began a violent uprising.
In Rwanda, the Hutu formed a political party. In 1960, they brought the feudal rule to an end and abolished the monarchy. The partisans of the deposed king sought to re-establish the monarchy. There were violent clashes, arson, bloodshed.
Tutsis fled the country, and in 1962, the Belgians withdrew from Rwanda. The majority Hutus took over the newly independent country, and for the next 2 decades, Rwanda was ruled by Hutu President General Juvenal Habyarimana. During this time, there was intermittent violence between Hutus and Tutsis, forcing thousands more Tutsis to flee to neighboring countries like Burundi and Uganda to escape ethnic violence. Those who remained were excluded from public service and military jobs, and politicians or journalists who questioned the government's methods were persecuted. In the mid-80s, Tutsis who were living in exile formed the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, a political and military movement aimed at taking back control of the country. In 1990, they invaded Rwanda, and a civil war marked by fierce fighting between the two sides continued for nearly 3 years, until a peace accord between the Rwandan government and the RPF was finally reached in August 1993. It allowed Tutsi refugees to return to Rwanda and called for the creation of a coalition between the Hutu government and the Tutsi-led RPF. But Hutu extremists within the Rwanda government were against the accord, and they secretly began organizing armed civilian militias, training them for a day when they would strike. And a local radio station owned by Hutu extremists began a process of undermining the peace accord by spreading messages of hate.
Radio was very instrumental in laying the groundwork, even at a very subconscious level in some ways, demonizing the Tutsi minority group. One of the theorists talks about this theory of self-defense, that if you can make people believe that what they are doing is actually legitimate, it's a form of self-defense. They are defending themselves from what is going to otherwise happen to them. And so it was very clever, the way this messaging was crafted on the radio station. It was demonizing the Tutsi, using bits of Rwandan sort of folklore and wordplay to refer to them as snakes and cockroaches.
This technique of demonization is something the world has seen before, when Jews were described by Nazis as vermin, and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia called its victims worms. So this was the situation in Rwanda just before the country would descend into unimaginable horrors. There was a tenuous peace between the minority Tutsis and majority Hutus after 3 years of civil war. To oversee implementation of the peace accord, the United Nations deployed 2,500 troops to Kigali, Rwanda's capital city. It was exactly the type of mission the UN was designed for. You may remember the UN was created following the atrocities of World War II, in part to ensure that a wholesale and systematic extermination of a group of people would never happen again. The UN mission was headed up by Canadian Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire. It was known by its acronym UNAMIR and had a very strict mandate. It wasn't there to enforce peace. It was just there to observe the process. UN soldiers, mainly from Belgium and Bangladesh, carried weapons, but they were told that under no circumstances were they to intervene. Under Chapter 6 of the United Nations, they could only act in self-defense. Over the next 6 months, President Habyarimana stalled on his promise to set up a coalition government. All the while, the Rwandan military trained civilian Hutu militias known as the Interahamwe, and extremist radio RTLM continued to broadcast hate messages against Tutsis. Human rights groups on the ground in Rwanda began warning the international community that something terrible was going to happen in the little African country. But the warning fell on deaf ears. Even General Dallaire, the man in charge of the UN mission, was ignored. In January 1994, Dallaire received a tip that the military and Hutu extremists were stockpiling weapons in caches around Kigali. The informant said lists were being made of all Tutsis, and that militias had enough resources to kill 1,000 people every 20 minutes. Dallaire sent a fax to the United Nations headquarters in New York, warning them that something horrible was being planned, possibly even genocide. He asked for permission to conduct raids to seize the weapons. But in a move that has haunted Dallaire and many others to this day, the UN officials told Dallaire to stand down. No action would be taken to disarm the Hutu militia groups. Dallaire later learned that U.S. President Bill Clinton and the UN Security Council were reluctant to let him act because of what had happened in Somalia the year before. You may remember that in October 1993, an American Special Operations team launched a raid in Mogadishu, and 2 Black Hawk helicopters were shot down. About 90 U.S. Rangers and Delta Force operators who rushed to the rescue were caught in an intense exchange of gunfire and were trapped overnight during an 18-hour urban firefight. It became known as the Battle of Mogadishu and left 18 Americans and hundreds of Somalis dead. News outlets broadcast searing images of jubilant mobs dragging the bodies of dead U.S. Army Special Operators and helicopter crewmen through the streets of Mogadishu. As a result, newly elected President Clinton halted the mission and ordered the Special Forces out of Somalia. No one wanted a repeat of that horrific incident. As Hutus stockpiled weapons, reporters monitoring the situation in Rwanda from other parts of Africa and around the world also started getting a sense that something was brewing. But for various reasons, media organizations chose to focus attention elsewhere.
I dropped the ball just like everybody else in the spring of 1994. I didn't fully grasp what was going on in Rwanda. And the Toronto Star, the paper that I worked for, did have an Africa correspondent, a guy named Paul Watson, who was very celebrated. He won a Pulitzer for his work in Somalia. But he was essentially locked down in South Africa because of the competing story of the end of apartheid and the election of Nelson Mandela. And he very specifically recalls that the Star foreign editor at the time told him, "You are not leaving South Africa until that election is over." And he was desperate to get to Rwanda because he had a sense of what was going on.
And while reporters like Paul Watson may have had a sense that trouble loomed, no one could have predicted the brutal massacre that would unfold over the next several months. In the evening of April 6, 1994, a plane was shot down near the Kigali airport. On board was the Hutu president of Rwanda and the president of Burundi. They were both killed. No one claimed responsibility for the attack, and the initial belief was that the Tutsi-led rebel group, the RPF, was responsible for shooting down the plane. But it is now widely suspected that extremist Hutus were behind the attack, worried that the president was about to finally implement the peace accord, which they were against. Either way, that night marked the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in human history. Immediately after the president's assassination, the Rwandan army seized control of the government, and with the help of the civilian militia group, the Interahamwe, they set up roadblocks around Kigali to filter out Rwandans whose official ID cards listed them as Tutsis. Hutu extremists went house to house, bludgeoning to death thousands of people, checking off their list of Tutsis, as well as moderate Hutu politicians who had supported the peace accord.
That political class was essentially decapitated in the first hours of the genocide. That was part of the operation. We have to eliminate this political opposition movement and then move on and continue this campaign of killing as many Tutsi as possible.
Rwanda's prime minister, a Hutu moderate, was second in command of the government. After the president's plane was shot down, UN soldiers were sent to guard the prime minister, who was at home with her husband and children. Not long after the Belgian soldiers took their positions, Rwandan military troops arrived at the prime minister's house. Before I go any further, I need to warn you that what I'm going to describe next is violent and disturbing. As Rwandan troops arrived at the house, they quickly disarmed the Belgian soldiers. Then, they violently beat and sexually assaulted the prime minister before she was shot and killed along with her husband. Her children managed to escape and were eventually resettled in Switzerland. The 10 Belgian soldiers sent to protect the prime minister were taken to the army barracks in the center of Kigali, where they were brutally tortured for several hours. Finally, General Dallaire received a call that the soldiers were at the Kigali hospital. Dallaire rushed to the scene, expecting to find his men in hospital beds. But instead, he was directed to a small hut at the far end of a courtyard in front of the morgue. In the hut, he discovered a haunting scene. The bodies of his Belgian soldiers were stacked on top of each other like sacks of potatoes. Their intertwined, tattered uniforms and mutilated bloody flesh made it impossible to do an accurate body count. Initially, Dallaire thought there were 11 bodies, but later it turned out to be 10. The killing of the Belgians was seen as a strategic plan by the Hutus to drive the UN peacekeepers out of the country at the start of the genocide. And it worked. Just like the US had done in Somalia after the Battle of Mogadishu, Belgium immediately pulled out of Rwanda at a time when their troops were needed more than ever. Thousands of people were being killed every day, their bodies left in the street as the armed militias made their way through Kigali in a frenzy of violence and mayhem. The scenes were horrific, but because there were only 2 reporters on the scene in Rwanda when the massacre began, it would take weeks before the world would understand the mass atrocity that was being unleashed on Tutsis. Media organizations scrambled to get reporters into Rwanda, and getting news out of the country was just as hard. TV reporters had no way to broadcast live. Tapes literally had to be hand-delivered to Nairobi in Kenya or other neighboring countries.
As the rescue of foreigners continued, European soldiers took Western families through streets littered with rotting bodies. Trucks hauled off victims, some of whom were buried alive because there were no doctors to check that they were dead.
Alan Thompson says initial reporting like this just didn't get the story right.
It was presented generally by the media as a civil war, right? And almost the kind of trope, the stereotype of the tribal anarchy, the tribal civil war of tribes wantonly killing each other in the streets of Rwanda. That was kind of the media template.
The media has also been criticized for focusing on the plight of foreigners inside Rwanda.
Part of the media narrative was, and this happens, it's a classic storyline, when crisis erupts somewhere, evacuating the foreigners, in this case, the white people. going back to Europe and North America. And then it became so dangerous to be there that just as the story itself was intensifying, the media coverage declined. You know, there's that contradiction. The story was picking up steam, and the journalists, most of them, left.
On April 11th, 5 days after the genocide began, a British camera operator named Nick Hughes, who was freelancing for the news agency WTN, captured some of the only footage of actual killings. Because it was unsafe for him to walk through the streets filming what was going on, he had to do it surreptitiously. Hughes went onto the roof of a school occupied by UN troops and pointed his camera at the unfolding tragedy below.
You know, it's blurry, it's from a distance. The camera wobbles a little bit now and then, but he's basically capturing the last moments of two people who you can see. Once you kind of train your eye, you can see these two individuals kneeling on the ground, one kind of crumpled over, and the other person with his arms outstretched and moving his hands back and forth as if he's beseeching his killers, or praying, saying something to those who are about to kill these two people. And he captures a few minutes of this footage.
If you look closely at the footage, it documents the true nature of what was really going on. It wasn't a civil war. It was a planned and deliberate ethnic cleansing.
The footage captured by Nick and by Mohammed Shafi, who had been there in the same location, is, I think, the only media video footage of a killing, of the act of genocide taking place. So then when you really look carefully at that few minutes, what's going on there, you realize this is targeted. These people have been pulled out of their homes and taken to the street. The death squad is, no one's running around, no one's chasing anyone. And then when you look again even more closely, a little bit further up the street, you see more bodies, another little pile of bodies, and then a little bit further up there are more bodies. So this crew has been working their way down the street, killing people, and finally at one point they come forward with some sort of clubs or implements and just beat these two people to death.
Within hours, Hughes took the grainy footage to the airport and gave it to a stranger who was boarding a flight to Nairobi, where it would be delivered to a producer. Then, according to Thompson, Hughes hollered through his satellite phone at the producer, who didn't seem to understand the urgency of getting to the airport to receive the package. The tape was eventually uploaded to London and distributed by the British agency WTN. That night and the next morning, the footage flashed across television screens on CNN and other networks around the world. But somehow the magnitude of what was going on in Rwanda was still lost on the rest of the world.
We generally, media audiences, didn't understand what we were seeing. We didn't know we were looking at prima facie evidence of genocide, a death squad at work. We thought we were looking at tribal warfare in Africa.
You might be wondering, what's the difference between the two? Why should it matter? Tribal or civil warfare is between organized groups within the same state or country. The aim of one side may be to take control of the country, to achieve independence for a region, or to change government policies. Genocide, on the other hand, is the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group, with the aim of destroying that nation or group. Why it matters? Well, the difference between the two is power. In a civil war, you have two opposing forces, where in genocide, you have one force with the intent to physically destroy a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And it's defined as a crime against humanity. Meanwhile, in Rwanda, as the mass killings quickly spread from Kigali to the rest of the country, Romeo Dallaire asked the United Nations Security Council for help. But again, he was refused. Instead, he was ordered to withdraw completely. Dallaire was shocked. In the years since, he has pointed out that the world's most developed nations had no problem sending in tens of thousands of reinforcements to the former Yugoslavia at the same time, and for similar reasons. But when Black Africans were in need, the world turned their back on them. Despite the order, Dallaire refused to leave, so he was reluctantly given permission to stay in Rwanda with a small force and limited supplies. Just 250 soldiers remained in the country. A tiny contingent of Canadian, Ghanaian, and Tunisian soldiers refused to leave and volunteered to remain with Dallaire, believing they had a moral obligation to stay and bear witness to what the rest of the world chose to ignore. One of their jobs was to guard the thousands of Tutsis who had gathered inside UN compounds and other places like churches, stadiums, and hotels.
My name is Paul Rusesabagina. I am the house manager of the most luxurious hotel in the capital of Rwanda. A place that my family and I happily called our home until the day everything changed.
Maybe you've seen or at least heard of the 2005 movie Hotel Rwanda, starring Don Cheadle. It's based on the amazing true story of a hotel manager who allowed Tutsis to take shelter inside the Hotel de Mille Collines. Paul Rusesabagina, a Hutu who is married to a Tutsi, relied on his connections as the manager of the upscale hotel to call in favors with some of the high-profile people who had been his customers. He used beer, cash, and cigars to bribe army generals and kept the 1,200 people under his care safe for more than 2 months. Inside the overcrowded facility, conditions grew worse as water and electricity ran out. And when the generator eventually broke down, the hotel was plunged into darkness. Outside the gates of the hotel, things were much worse. Again, what I'm describing is graphic and violent. Those who hadn't made it inside were hacked to death by machete, burned alive, or shot. And similar horrors took place around the country as the killings continued.
Tens of thousands of rotting corpses are washing up on the Ugandan side of Lake Victoria. That's prompted the government there to declare a disaster area because of the risk of disease. Officials are appealing for international assistance, saying they do not have the means to remove the dead bodies.
In Nyarubai, a district in the East Province of Rwanda, the nightmare began on April 16th, 10 days after the president's plane was shot down. More than 30 Hutu killers carrying knives and clubs surrounded a church where Tutsi men, women, and children had taken shelter. The violent mob threw grenades into the large red brick building and butchered anyone who survived the blast. In just 2 days, 35,000 people were killed inside the church and the nearby neighborhood.
Eyewitnesses said the killers left the scene of the church singing that they had killed all the Tutsis.
The killers were militiamen and Rwanda soldiers, but they were also regular Hutu people who turned against their Tutsi neighbors. The Hutu extremist radio RTLM continued to broadcast messages encouraging Hutus to grab garden tools and anything else they could find, then hunt down and kill or maim Tutsis who had lived in their community. The station even broadcast the names of people to be killed and their whereabouts. Then the radio played music that the militiamen could dance to as they killed. The slaughter of Tutsis continued for 100 days, until the Tutsi RPF, led by Paul Kagame, restarted their offensive and took control of the country by cutting off government supply routes and taking advantage of deteriorating conditions in Rwanda. They finally seized control of Kigali on July 4th, 1994. By then, between 800,000 and 1 million people, mainly Tutsis, were murdered. Up to 250,000 women were sexually assaulted, many of whom were infected with HIV. And 95,000 children were left orphaned. The crisis was far from over. As Kagame and his Tutsi-dominated party assumed leadership of Rwanda, more than 2 million Hutus, fearing retaliation, left the country, making a perilous journey to the Democratic Republic of Congo and other neighboring countries.
The refugees are starting to die by the hundreds along the roadside, where they stay until somebody comes by to take them to mass graves. Right now, it's mainly dehydration and hunger that's killing them. Relief agencies simply cannot airlift in emergency supplies quickly enough.
As refugee camps became overcrowded, they were hit by a terrible cholera epidemic, striking young and old, spreading through bad water and human waste.
With no latrines and not enough fresh water, the best the medics can do for many of the victims is ease their last moments and call in the transports when the bodies start to pile up.
At least 35,000 people died from cholera, and even more deaths were associated with ethnic violence that continued inside the camps. Some of the Hutus in the camps were militiamen who continued to attack Tutsis, which led in part to the brutal wars that raged off and on in the DRC from 1996 to 2003. The ripple effect of the Rwandan genocide continues to be felt today, on a personal level for the people involved, and on a global level for the world at large that chose to turn away. In October 1994, an international criminal tribunal for Rwanda was set up in Tanzania. And it marked the first international tribunal since the Nazi Nuremberg trials following World War II. And it was the first with a mandate to prosecute the crime of genocide. The trials continued over the next 15 years and resulted in thousands of convictions, including the 2008 conviction of 3 former senior Rwandan defense and military officials who organized the genocide. They were sentenced to life in prison. Romeo Dallaire, the Canadian general in charge of the UN mission, has battled his own personal demons since leaving Rwanda. Dallaire has spoken publicly about how after he asked to be relieved from duty, he began acting recklessly, hoping it would bring an end to his guilt and pain. After returning to Canada, Dallaire attempted suicide 4 times. One night, after an emotionally grueling therapy session, he bought a bottle of scotch, sat on a park bench, and drank the whole thing. He spent hours crying and preparing to end his life until help arrived. Now, after years of therapy, Dallaire says he has a will to live, and he continues to be a tireless advocate for veterans, child soldiers, and human rights. But he says a piece of his soul will always remain in Rwanda.
I live every day what I lived 20 years ago, and it's as if it was this morning.
As for Paul Rusesabagina, the man who saved thousands of lives inside Hotel Rwanda, after the Oscar-nominated movie brought him to the world's attention, he became a human rights icon, especially in the U.S., where he was applauded by Oprah and awarded the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom. In recent years, while living in exile, he has accused Rwanda's current president, Paul Kagame, of human rights abuses and alleged that the government is targeting Hutus. You may remember Kagame was leader of the RPF during the genocide, and he has led the country ever since, first as leader of the army, then as president, a position he has held since the year 2000. His record has been extraordinarily mixed. He's done an incredible job helping rebuild life in Rwanda since the genocide, but he's also sponsored violence around the region, consolidated authoritarian power, and killed or muzzled political dissidents. Paul Rusesabagina is among those targeted by Kagame. In 2020, the former hotel manager was lured back to his home country under false pretenses and arrested on terrorism charges. In September of this year, he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Rusesabagina's supporters have labeled the trial a sham, and they say it's proof of Kagame's ruthless treatment of political opponents. In the over 25 years since the Rwandan genocide, a lot has changed in the world, especially technology. And it's hard not to wonder if a similar public killing of hundreds of thousands of people could happen today. Even when no reporters are present, surely many people in all parts of the world have access to smartphones and the internet. But would that be enough? Alan Thompson says not necessarily. He points to the recent conflict in Syria.
It's probably one of the most highly mediated conflicts ever because of the prevalence of mobile phones and the ability of ordinary people to capture images and to share on social media events that were occurring, things that were unfolding. So we were flooded with imagery and information from Syria, and still talked about crossing red lines and talked about and never effectively acted internationally to intervene and to end that conflict.
Thompson says now more than ever, journalists must continue to use every tool at their disposal to tell these important stories when there are vulnerable people who don't have a voice and can't be heard. Thanks for listening to this look back at a terrible time in history. The Rwandan genocide is a difficult story to tell and to listen to, but it is incredibly important to remember. Thanks also to Alan Thompson for his assistance with this story. I'll put information in the show notes about the great book he edited called Media and Mass Atrocity, the Rwandan Genocide and Beyond. Plus, I'll drop in a few other resources you can check out if you want to learn more. This episode topic was suggested by several listeners, including Brenda and Alicia. Thanks to them and all of you who send me ideas. If you have a suggestion, you can let me know. Send me a message on Twitter and Facebook at 1990s History or on Instagram at that90spodcast. You can also email me at 90s@curiouscast.ca. That's 90s@curiouscast.ca. This episode was written and hosted by me, Kathy Gonzora. Our producer is Dila Velasquez. And sound design and final production is by Rob Johnston. See you next time for more history of the 90s. If you were a kid or a teen in the 90s, there was probably one electronic toy or gadget you just had to have. Something all your friends were talking about. Or maybe you saw it on a commercial during Saturday morning cartoons. Whatever it was, you couldn't live without it. The 90s were an era filled with new and inventive tech toys. Some were groundbreaking, while others, well, they seem a bit laughable now. Like, remember you could print off photos and make them into stickers? Those items hold a very special place in the heart of anyone who grew up in the 90s, because it was a time when things felt super advanced and yet simple at the same time. I'm Kathy Gonzora, and on this episode of History of the 90s, we're going to take a look back at some of the most memorable electronic toys and gadgets of the 90s. So let's dive right in. First up, everyone's favorite virtual pet, the Tamagotchi. The little egg-shaped gadget took the world by storm beginning in 1996. And before the original fad fizzled out, it became one of the most successful toys in history, selling over 80 million units worldwide. In case you're one of the very few people who didn't experience this phenomenon firsthand, let me give you a brief explainer about the toy. The Tamagotchi is a little plastic egg-shaped gadget on a keychain that's equipped with a monochrome LCD screen where you can watch the life of your digital pet. With a few bleeps and bloops, it hatches from an egg. Then the pet owner uses 3 buttons to feed, discipline, and play with the little guy. Take good care of it, and the hatchling evolves into one of 7 adult characters. Ignore it, and well, your Tamagotchi wouldn't be so happy.
I always remember it. Mine would just scream all of the time, and my parents would get annoyed because at the dinner table, my Tamagotchi in my pocket would just be screaming because there's just poop everywhere over the screen and I haven't cleaned it.
That's Brandon Saltalamacchia. He runs a website called Retro Dodo that looks at retro gaming and other products. He says if you didn't look after your Tamagotchi, it could get sick, or even worse, die.
Which is a bit brutal now that you look at it, but I think it was a good life lesson for children to teach them if you don't look after something, all your hard work will end up disappearing.
It may have been a good lesson, but it was also quite stressful for kids and their parents, because the only time the Tamagotchi rested was at night. I'll get into that in a minute, but first, let's look back at how these little creatures came to life. The idea for the Tamagotchi came from a 30-year-old data entry clerk at the Bandai Toy Company in Japan. Bandai is the same company responsible for the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers craze in 1994 and would eventually merge with Sega. Akameda was watching TV when she thought of a toy pet that kids could look after and take with them everywhere they went. So Maeda went to toy designer Akihiro Yokoi, and together they hatched the idea for an egg-shaped handheld pet, which they called Tamagotchi, a mashup of the Japanese words for egg and friend. They also came up with the toy's origin story. Tamagotchi is an alien creature who traveled from its home planet millions of miles in suspended animation to learn about Earth. Maeda and Yokoi created a couple hundred prototypes and took them to high school girls in Tokyo and let them play with the world's first digital pet for a few months. Very smart marketing move, because teenage girls in Japan in the 90s were the trendsetters. Known for their phenomenal ability to create hits throughout something called kuchikomi, or lightning-fast word of mouth that spread to their peers, along with siblings and parents. At the time, it was common for marketing firms to use high school girls in Japan to create booms for clients in industries ranging from automotive to cosmetics. They were the original influencers before social media. After a few months of playing with the Tamagotchis and creating a buzz, the high school girls provided some feedback on improvements, and an upgraded Tamagotchi was finally released by Bandai to the Japanese public in November 1996. The toy was an instant success, selling 4 million units in the first 4 months, which isn't too surprising considering Japan's love of gadgets had been on the rise since the 1960s. George McNamara, a professor at Georgetown University who specialized in Japanese culture, told the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1997 that the Japanese had grown attached to the consumer electronics industry, which lifted them to a world economic power after World War II. Much like the United States' fascination with the automobile, which generated similar economic success. It wasn't just teens and kids who loved the Tamagotchi. A lot of adults were buying them too. Professional men were seen nursing their virtual pets while taking the subway to and from work in Japan. A 27-year-old computer programmer told Associated Press in December '96 that he would bring the toy to work and be proud of it because his colleagues didn't have it yet. He also admitted that he might have to stop working and run to the men's room to secretly care for his virtual pet. And a 35-year-old woman told AP that she decided to get a Tamagotchi when she saw so many other women at her office playing with them. At the time, there were already dozens of other keychain video games in Japan, but the Tamagotchi stole the show, igniting a buying frenzy. It was common for hundreds of shoppers to line up for hours outside Tokyo toy stores when a new shipment of Tamagotchis arrived. And soon, the toy was selling on the black market for hundreds of dollars. After taking Japan by storm, the Tamagotchi launched in North America, Britain, and France in May 1997, selling for about $20 US. After months of hype about the virtual pet, kids outside of Japan and their parents were eager to get their hands on one. FAO Schwarz in the United States sold 30,000 units in the first 3 days. And QVC, the television retailer, sold 6,000 in 5 minutes. Soon, kids were bringing Tamagotchis to school, and all that beeping and booping became a huge distraction as kids checked on their pets every few minutes. And that led to some schools banning the device. The New York Times wrote this about the situation in 1997. In many Japanese families, the wife, who tends to be a homemaker, looks after the Tamagotchi when her children are at school. In America, where more women work, the keychain chicks might become latchkey chicks, raising the possibility that without constant attention, virtual chicks will turn out to be bad eggs. But seriously, not only could they become bad eggs, they might possibly die. Well, actually, when Bandai launched the toy outside of Japan, they toned down the whole dying thing, saying instead that the Tamagotchi's life cycle ends when it sprouts its wings and returns to its home planet millions of miles away. It can then be reset to hatch a new creature, but the one that has sprouted wings is gone forever. In Japan, the version there was a little harsher. After the Tamagotchi died, the device showed a gravestone and a cross. Kids were so attached to these virtual pets that when they died or went to cyberspace, it could be quite traumatic. For those who didn't want to hit reset and start over, the owner of a pet cemetery in the Cornish countryside of southern England offered them a solution. Terry Squires fenced off a special area of the cemetery where Tamagotchis could be buried. Kids either came in person for the interment, which included a tiny coffin, a little square wooden box, or they simply mailed the virtual pet to Squires, who looked after the burial. Squires received Tamagotchis from Switzerland, Germany, France, Canada, and the United States. As soon as Tamagotchi launched in the US, there were already knockoffs. Toy makers had been watching the virtual pet craze sweep Japan and got busy making their own versions. Tiger Electronics brought out a line of Gigapets on the same day as Tamagotchi sales began in the US. Priced slightly cheaper at $9.99, Gigapets initially offered 6 different pets, which featured real animals like CompuKitty and Digital Doggy. But it later expanded into several licensed characters, including Salem the Cat from the popular TV show starring Melissa Joan Hart, Sabrina the Teenage Witch. According to PC Mag, Gigapets were very popular in the United States, but they never really held the same mystique as the original Tamagotchi. Nano Pets, made by toy maker Playmates, were also introduced in 1997 and initially included a cat called Nano Kitty, a dog, and even a human baby that pooped on the tiny LCD screen. Over the next decade, both Bandai and other companies released dozens, if not hundreds, of variations of the Pocket virtual pet formula. And though they might not be as common, the Tamagotchi never really went away. In 2013, Bandai recreated Tamagotchi as an app, which more or less replicated the experience of raising a Tamagotchi on a smartphone. In 2017, Bandai created a new Tamagotchi to mark its 20th anniversary, selling for just $15. Then in 2019, a new version for a new generation was released. The Tamagotchi On sells for $60, but has some pretty cool upgrades. First of all, the screen is in color. Second, you can connect to other Tamagotchis, get married, raise kids. But most importantly, you can send your pet to the Tamagotchi Hotel when you need someone to babysit. 30 years later, the makers of the toy understand that it takes a village to raise a virtual pet. I mentioned Tiger Electronics was the company behind Gigapets. Well, the toy company was actually a major player in the 80s and 90s when it comes to toy fads. Tiger Electronics was founded in Vernon Hills, Illinois in 1978 by Roger Schiffman and Randy Rissman, who originally just planned to market record players. But by 1985, they had pivoted to a line of handheld video games.
Some people will do anything to take their favorite video games everywhere they go. But now Tiger gives you all the fun and excitement of your favorite arcade game in the palm of your hand.
Tiger handhelds actually predate Nintendo's Game Boy, which I'm going to talk about shortly. But they were pretty basic. They featured just a single game with simplistic controls, a monochrome LCD screen, and tinny sound at best. Despite their simplicity, the Tiger handhelds remained popular through the 80s and into the 90s, even after more advanced handheld video games were released. The big reason for the success? The price tag. Tiger handhelds were quite a bit cheaper than Game Boy and its competitors, coming in at just $20, which made them very appealing.
You know, you see it in the store and a kid just can't help but buy it. And in reality, they have a very short shelf life. You know, a kid will play it for a few days and it gets a little bit boring. So then you want to go and buy The Lion King or Sonic or X-Men one, which, I don't know, I can imagine back then was like $20, $30, which you end up buying 3 or 4. You could have just bought a Game Boy with a few games back then.
The other big reason for their success was the fact that Tiger licensed just about every major property, from TV shows and movies to sports stars and popular video game brands. So there were dozens and dozens of Tiger handhelds available to purchase. From Sonic the Hedgehog to Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter to Michael Jordan in Flight and The Lion King. Tiger Electronics, which is now a subsidiary of Hasbro, brought back 6 of the Tiger handheld games in 2019. Which means that for $14.99, you can experience some retro gaming exactly as it was 25 years ago. In addition to handheld video games, Tiger Electronics had a ton of other popular electronic toys, including the Talk Boy, which actually started off as a movie prop.
Plaza Hotel reservations, may I help you?
Howdy, Jim. This is Peter McAllister, the father.
Yes, sir.
Like a hotel room, please.
Yes.
With an extra large bed, a TV, and one of those little refrigerators you have to open with a key.
Yes, sir. You'll need a major credit card upon check-in.
Credit card? You got it.
You might remember that in the 1992 movie Home Alone 2, Kevin, played by Macaulay Culkin, has a talk boy. It's this small tape recorder that allows him to modify his voice with a simple little push of the speed control button. Kevin is alone in New York after getting separated from his parents at the airport. He uses the talk boy to disguise his voice as his dad's so that he can book himself a room at the Plaza Hotel. Director John Hughes designed the little device himself and then took it to Roger Schiffman at Tiger Electronics and asked him to bring the idea to life. After the movie came out, kids and their parents rushed to toy stores to buy a talk boy, which was priced at $30. But there was one problem. It didn't work exactly like the one in the movie. Mainly, there was no voice modulator. It was just a tape recorder. The next year, when Home Alone 2 was distributed on video, the problem was fixed. A new Talk Boy Deluxe was released, and it worked just like Kevin's.
You can have lots of high-tech fun with Tiger's Talk Boy tape recorder. It even has speed control.
Hi, kids, we're home early.
Hi, kids, we're home early.
Every videotape of Home Alone 2 came with a brochure advertising the Talk Boy Deluxe, and demand went through the roof. So much so that toy stores were totally caught off guard when parents shopping for Christmas gifts bought up all of their stock. And Talk Boy Deluxe became one of the best-selling toys of 1993. Tiger Electronics was also behind another fad that left parents scrambling to get their hands on an ultra-creepy talking gremlin.
What's that? Oh, it's my Furby. Tickle me. Furby, the first gigapet you pet. Pet me.
The creators of Furby were actually inspired by the Tamagotchi. In early 1997, David Hampton and Caleb Chung saw the Tamagotchi in action for the first time at the annual Toy Fair trade show in New York. They thought it was pretty cool, but it had one major drawback. You couldn't pet it. So Hampton and Chung began designing an electronic companion you could pet. The working name for the toy was Furball, and it spoke a mishmash of Japanese, Thai, Chinese, and Hebrew, languages Hampton had picked up while serving overseas in the U.S. Navy. They licensed the toy to Tiger Electronics, and the Furball with big eyes and pointy ears hit stores in October 1998. By the end of the year, just a few months later, 1.8 million Furbies had been sold. Parents lined up outside stores for hours to purchase a $30 Furby for Christmas that year. Some parents who didn't get one paid scalpers 3 times that much to get their hands on a Furby. The following year, in 1999, Tiger Electronics sold 14 million Furbies, cementing its place as the must-have toy of the late 90s. Kids either loved it or they were terrified by it.
Furbies were huge. They sold millions of units, but now you look at it and it's almost scary to look at. I have one here and I have to put it in my wardrobe just to keep it away, because if I see it in the middle of the night, I'm not going to be able to sleep all night because they just look so scary now. And you feed them with your finger. They wake up in the middle of the night, still to this day. Somehow the battery's still working from like 15 years. It's just a really odd product.
For the kids that loved it, part of the appeal was Furby's ability to learn English. As I said, it started off speaking a form of gibberish called Furbish, which could be deciphered with the help of a dictionary that came with the toy. But over time, Furby could be trained to start replacing key phrases with English. Furby would also say yum after you fed it by sticking your finger in its mouth, and you could also make it purr by patting its back.
Hey,
I'm sorry, but that's just terrifying. And if that's not scary enough, hackers soon found a way to make Furbies say just about anything. Because the Furby was one of the first widely marketed toy robots, it also appealed to the hacking community, and hacking them became a well-documented hobby. Entire websites depict how to hack a Furby to, among other things, change its voice and its vocabulary. In the early years, there were also some news stories about whether the microphone inside Furby was listening in on private conversations, much like fears today about practically every device in your home. But it was never proven that Furbies were eavesdropping. An updated version of Furby was released in 2005. But by then, the craze had pretty much run its course, and Furby was soon pushed aside for new toy fads like Webkins. But if you think that was the end of the creepy little guy, it wasn't. Several reboots have been released, including Furby Connect in 2016, which is app compatible. The app, which is called Furby World Connect, lets you hatch and care for furblings and build an entire village for your furry pets. The newest Furby isn't cheap, though, coming in at just over $100. I mentioned that Tiger Electronics is a subsidiary of Hasbro now. Roger Schiffman and Randy Rissman sold the company in 1998 to Hasbro for $335 million. After the acquisition, Tiger Electronics released yet another toy that would become an obsession with kids in the late 90s and early 2000s.
Hit it! Coming at you right between the ears is Hit Clips. Music to get you grooving. Hit Clips is a slick micro audio system. This type package is small, but pumps out monster sound. Like this.
Hit Clips first appeared in McDonald's Happy Meals in 1999. They were called a micro music system and soon became so popular that they were released in toy stores everywhere. Again, if you somehow missed this phenomenon, let me explain. Hit Clips were tiny little memory cards that played 60 seconds of a hit pop song on a little player shaped like a boombox or a CD player. Essentially, it was an early version of digital music, which is pretty cool. But like I said, it only played 60 seconds of the song. So if you really like the song, you'd have to go out and buy the CD to hear the whole thing. It was incredibly annoying, but a highly effective marketing tool for record companies promoting acts like Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, and Britney Spears. And kids, well, they didn't seem to mind.
Best thing about Hit Clips? Always something new. New players, and the newest music, like Michelle Branch. Get the music going.
Hit Clips players include one Hit Clips music chip. Other music chips.
The clips, which sold for about $4 each, became highly collectible. And the more you had dangling from your backpack, the cooler you were.
What was good about them is that you could, just like Pokemon cards and Game Boy cartridges, that you could trade them with your friends. Let's say you had a song, your friend had a song, you just trade the cartridge at school and you've got yourself a new song.
Well, actually 60 seconds of a song, but whatever, close enough. By 2002, Tiger Electronics had sold 20 million Hit Clips, making $80 million off their latest toy gold mine. Okay, so there were a lot of cool electronic toys in the 90s, but there is one that was more than a fad. It was a revolution.
They said it wasn't humanly possible, but now you can have all the power and excitement of Nintendo right in the palm of your hand. Introducing Game Boy.
Nintendo's Game Boy was actually released in 1989, but it ruled the 1990s, and it changed the entire concept of portable gaming, creating a baseline for every handheld console that followed. Game Boy was created by Gunpei Yokoi. The Japanese video game designer previously developed Nintendo's Game & Watch handheld device, which was sold from 1980 to 1991. Like the Tiger handhelds, the Game & Watch featured a single game, but also a watch function. And it also introduced the world to Nintendo's iconic cross-shaped D-pad controller. Legend has it that Yokoi got the idea for Nintendo's first portable gaming system after watching a bored businessman playing on a calculator while he rode the train home from work. After Game & Watch launched, Yokoi continued to work on ways to improve portable gaming. And in 1985, he filed the patent for what would become Game Boy. The patent described it as a handheld electronic game machine for use with detachable memory game packs or cartridges. That was the game changer. users could play more than one game on a single device, opening up a world of possibilities. I should say that Game Boy wasn't actually the first handheld game with interchangeable cartridges. That was the Microvision, released in 1979 by Milton Bradley. But the Microvision had lots of technical issues and only stayed on the market for a couple of years. The Game Boy launched first in Japan in April 1989 and immediately sold out its initial run of 300,000 units. 3 months later, it hit shelves in North America. Initially, Nintendo US planned on including Super Mario Land with every Game Boy, but at the last minute acquired the rights to Tetris, the highly addictive puzzle game that was sweeping the nation.
And what that was good at is not only was it good at getting the kids involved, the parents could, when the kids go to sleep, pick up the Game Boy and play it. And it's a game that every generation, and depending on how old you are, you're going to be entertained by it. And it was such an easy game to pick up and play and understand that, it almost made the Game Boy sell as many as it did because, it was such a great game for every generation.
Tetris was designed by a 29-year-old Russian software designer, Alexei Pajitnov, in 1984. Initially, the game was secretly shared among Soviet programmers by copying it onto a floppy disk. It spread throughout the USSR until a salesman at a Hungary-based software company caught wind of it and asked Pajitnov if he wanted to sell it to countries outside the Eastern Bloc. After jumping through some hoops, they got permission to export the game to the West, where it was initially distributed on PCs. Tetris was an immediate hit, earning ecstatic reviews and selling in healthy quantities. But that was just the beginning. When Tetris was released with Game Boy, it became an absolute sensation, becoming one of the most popular video games of all time, selling 35 million copies on Game Boy alone. Anyone who's played the Falling Blocks puzzle game knows it's super addictive. And apparently when it was first released, people spent so much time in front of screens playing Tetris that they developed a weird side effect. Even after they stopped playing the game, they could still see images of falling pieces when they closed their eyes. Some people even saw Tetris tiles in their dreams. This became known as the Tetris effect, and in recent years has come to apply to other games that people play for extended periods of time, also called gaming-induced pseudo-hallucinations or game transfer phenomena. The original Game Boy wasn't super high-tech. In fact, it contained a dated 8-bit microprocessor with a tiny 2.5-inch monochrome screen, which meant graphics were limited to shades of gray on a dull green background. That's because Yokoi had a very unique design philosophy, which he called lateral thinking with withered technology. It essentially meant using cheap, readily available components in interesting ways. And that was the key to success for Game Boy. Let me explain. Because Game Boy didn't have expensive hardware and battery-zapping color displays, it was a truly portable gaming system that you could take with you and use for a long time. In fact, a Game Boy could survive 30 hours of playing on just 4 AA batteries. And it was relatively cheap, selling for $90. Game Boy's competitors were much more advanced with color displays, but as a result were more expensive and they burned through batteries. 6 batteries lasted only a few hours. Take the Atari Lynx, released just a few months after the Game Boy. It was technically superior in almost every way. It had a backlit color screen and it was based around 16-bit architecture, but at $180, the Lynx cost nearly twice as much as the Game Boy. Sega's Game Gear was released the next year in 1990 and was a bit cheaper than the Atari Lynx at $150, but it was notorious for its short battery life. When Nintendo launched Game Boy in the US, the company had a $20 million marketing plan, which was a lot for a company which was known for being pretty frugal. Typically, Nintendo went after the 9 to 14 age group, but this time they were aiming at 15 to 16-year-old boys. They wanted it to be the cool older brother game. 95% of the marketing budget was spent on television ads, like this one.
It's portable, it's in stereo, and its games are interchangeable. Plus, Game Boy comes with the outrageous new game, Tetris. And for head-to-head competition, use the revolutionary video link and blow your opponent away. Game Boy.
And even though Nintendo's main marketing group were teen boys, they were also interested in girls and adults. In the 90s, technology was seen as a cure for stress instead of the cause of stress.
The adult world is designed to keep us moving. And while this may make us more efficient, it's not exactly a party. Luckily, technology has produced a cure. It's called a Game Boy, the personal game-playing system from Nintendo, with lots of sports, action, and puzzle games to choose from. And it comes with a puzzle game, Tetris. It could change your outlook.
Peter Main, Nintendo's vice president for marketing, told the New York Times in 1989, "We think that handhelds have broad appeal. The guy out fishing, the businessman on the airplane, the kid on the school bus. We think they'll all like it." Something else that Nintendo pushed about the new Game Boy was its head-to-head connectivity. For the first time, Game Boy's Game Link cable allowed simultaneous multiplayer gaming on a portable system. Don Coiner, head of marketing for Nintendo US, said head-to-head play was this really aspirational thing. Not that many people did it, but everyone imagined doing it. And when they did do it, it was really fun. So it was one of those hooks that we sort of grabbed onto as a thing to do. Nintendo produced 1 million Game Boys for the US in 1989 and sold all of them. Zoom ahead 3 years, and American sales stood at 9 million units. In 1996, Nintendo introduced the thinner, lighter Game Boy Pocket, which retained the same hardware setup, but unlike the original, it actually did fit in your pocket. Then, in late 1998, the Game Boy Color was released, taking Nintendo's handheld device to the next level.
The great thing about the Game Boy Color is that it was the first Game Boy that came with a colored screen, because originally, if you look back, you probably remember like the old green, seaweed, sick-looking color of the screen that wasn't very nice to look at, but the Game Boy Color kind of changed the game, literally with a colored screen.
It also had a bigger screen and a more natural curved case that fit better in players' hands. And because it was backwards compatible with the older Game Boy, players had a huge library of games to choose from. Nintendo also launched a bunch of new games with Game Boy Color, including Pokemon Red and Blue, which kicked off the whole Pokemon craze that continues to this day. Pokemon Red and Blue was actually released in Japan first in 1996, where the tiny pocket monsters quickly became a cultural phenomenon that included a card game, television show, and movie. When Nintendo released Pokemon Red and Blue in North America in September 1998, an animated TV show and card game were unveiled at the same time, unleashing the pocket monster craze in the West. By January 1st, 1999, the Washington Post declared on their annual list of what's in and out that Pokemon is in and Tamagotchis are out.
I remember walking up to the shops with my old man and him buying a packet of Pokemon cards for £2, and there was this shiny Machamp in it, and that's when it all started, really. That's when it started getting not troublesome, but you'd go to school and try and talk your friends into trading their rare card for your terrible card.
Soon trouble was brewing at schools where kids weren't paying attention in class or were getting into fights while trading cards. And just like Tamagotchis before them, Pokemon cards were soon banned by some school principals. In November 1999, Pokemon the first movie opened at the top of the domestic box office, and by the end of 1999, barely more than a year after Pokemon's US debut, and just a few years after its Japanese introduction, the Pokemon franchise cracked $7 billion in global lifetime revenues. Thanks in part to Pokemon and Tetris, along with dozens of other popular games like The Legend of Zelda, Kirby's Dream Land, and Super Mario World, the Game Boy and Game Boy Color sold over 118 million units before they were discontinued in 2001 in favor of the Game Boy Advance, which sold another 81 million units. With its various versions of Game Boy, Nintendo helped create and define the portable video game market, something it has continued to do with the 3DS and now the uber-popular Nintendo Switch. Compared to the Switch, Game Boy looks like it belongs in a museum as a relic of the past. Actually, an original 1989 Game Boy is in the Smithsonian alongside early cell phones, PDAs, and pagers in a display at the American Enterprise exhibit. You know you're getting old when the stuff you played with as a kid or a teen is now on display at a museum. Or maybe it just means your generation had really cool toys. Thanks for joining me on this look back at some of the greatest electronic toys of the 90s. I'd love to know what your favorite gadget was. You can let me know by reaching out through Twitter at 1990s History and on Instagram and Facebook. Or send an email to 90s@curiouscast.ca. That's 90s@curiouscast.ca. And while you're there, let me know what topics you'd like covered on the show. Thanks to Brandon Saltalamacchia for taking the time to talk to me about some of his favorite 90s gadgets and toys. If this topic is something you want more of, make sure you check out his website, retrododo.com. I'll put more info about Brandon in the show notes. This episode was hosted and written by me, Kathy Canzora. Dila Velasquez is our producer, and Rob Johnston is in charge of sound design and final production. See you next time for more history of the 90s.
Hey, I'm Brett Chang.
And I'm Jay Rosenthal.
And we're here to tell you about Canada's only daily business news podcast.
It's called The Peak Daily, and every morning we get you up to speed on the need-to-know Canadian and global business news stories.
And we do it without all the jargon that can make business news a little
dull.
Dull, exactly.
And we do it all in less than 10 minutes.
6 minutes if we fast forward through your dad jokes.
But I prefer to call them rad jokes.
Come for the news, stay for the dad jokes. Join us and thousands of Peak Pals every morning to start your day smarter. Find The Peak Daily wherever you listen to your podcasts.
In the summer of 1987, 4 young DJs from London took a trip to the Mediterranean island of Ibiza for a birthday celebration. On their first night, they heard about a club called Amnesia and a new party drug called ecstasy. The guys decided to check it out, making their way to Amnesia, which was a converted farmhouse miles away from where they were staying. The club opened at 3 a.m. after the other clubs shut down, and the party usually lasted until midday. It was surrounded by large whitewashed walls and an open-air dance floor with a large mirrored pyramid in the middle. The guys tried ecstasy, then joined several thousand euphoric people who danced in the warm Mediterranean air under the stars. By the time they returned home to London, the experience had changed their lives, and the 4 DJs would go on to pioneer a massive youth culture movement that spread from the UK through Europe and around North America. I'm Kathy Canzora, and this is History of the 90s, a podcast about a decade that changed the world. On this episode, the rise and fall of 90s rave culture. A few months after UK DJ Danny Rampling returned from that magical trip to Ibiza, he hosted one of the first raves in London. December 5th, 1987, marked the beginning of something that became known as the Acid House Revolution. Rampling, along with his friends Paul Oakenfold, Johnny Walker, and Nicky Holloway, were swept away by the ecstasy-fueled party at Amnesia and the music played by the club's legendary DJ, Alfredo. And now they were going to bring it to London. Alfredo spun a mix of techno and house music, which was different from the hip-hop and rare groove that dominated the London club scene at the time. Rampling's first rave, which he called Shoom, was held in the basement of a fitness center in South London. The gym equipment was pushed to one side of the room and then covered up with a fluorescent Dayglow banner featuring the now iconic yellow smiley faces associated with acid house music and rave culture. But fun fact, Rampling has said the smiley logo was actually adopted from the Watchmen comic book series. Rampling set up his DJ console in front of the banner, and for the next 6 hours, a few hundred young people danced to the sounds Rampling was introduced to in Ibiza. House music was new to Rampling and London partygoers, but it had been around for a while. Born in Chicago in the early 80s with DJs like Jesse Saunders, who started using the Roland 808 drum machine and 303 bass synthesizer on disco sampling hits like the 1984 mega mix On and On. Here, have a listen.
Just say you must go on and on, goes on and on.
That recording inspired other Chicago DJs like Frankie Knuckles to use the now iconic sounds of the 808 and 303 synth to arrange their own DIY dance tracks, birthing a new underground sound called house music. It's believed it was called house music because Frankie Knuckles was a DJ at the legendary club The Warehouse, a former factory where young, predominantly black gay men came to dance in what was still a heavily segregated club scene. If you're unfamiliar with it, acid house is a subgenre of house music, and it's characterized by the alien sounds of the 303 synth on tracks like this one, Future's Acid Tracks. Acid house was referring to LSD, but it wasn't. It got the name because of the seething, burbling acid sound produced by the 303 bass synthesizer. However, that doesn't mean drugs were not a big part of this scene. Shoom was where many new ravers in London tried ecstasy or MDMA for the first time. The euphoric psychotropic drug was created by German scientists in 1912 and experimented with by the CIA in the 1950s during the Cold War. I'll talk more about ecstasy in just a little bit. Rampling calls that first event in a crammed gym basement a complete breath of fresh air. He told The Guardian that it was small and intimate and attracted a group of like-minded people of all races, colors, and sexual preferences, a mixture of art students, street kids, and fashion people. He said the basement only held 300 people, but within a few months, there were thousands waiting to get in. And over the next few years, Shoom would relocate to bigger venues a couple of times before shutting down in 1990. Shoom had such a profound effect on its regulars that many of them soon either lost their jobs or created new ones so they could fully embrace their new life as a raver. Rampling's wife, Jenny, who ran Shoom with him, had to print an open letter in a rave fanzine asking people not to give up their jobs because so many of them were. The whole scene exploded within a matter of 3 or 4 months. Across Britain, similar raves were being held at warehouses, factories, fields, and clubs like Fantasia, Universe, Amnesia House, and ESP. Some were legal, others weren't, and to keep them secret, locations were often broadcast on pirate radio stations. What followed in Britain is referred to as the Second Summer of Love, but it was actually 2 summers. In 1988 and 1989, more than 2 decades after the original Summer of Love in 1967, acid house music and ecstasy fueled an explosion of youth counterculture that featured massive raves in fields and warehouses around the country. The movement emulated the free spirit and hedonism of the 60s and was the apex of the rave culture in the UK. Almost every weekend, there would be up to 40 raves in southeast England. Many of them were outdoors, attracting convoys of cars that carried thousands of people. But as reports of wild drug use and general debauchery made the news, raves unleashed a national moral panic.
Hello and welcome. Tonight we look at the growing concern over acid house parties, which attract thousands of young people in the region. Police and politicians say they want them banned in the interests of public safety.
The bad press, along with a number of reportedly drug-related accidents and increasing police enforcement, caused raves to go completely underground at the beginning of the 90s. Then in 1992, a massive party on Castlemorton Common in the Malvern Hills of Worcestershire changed everything. A group of New Age travelers, previously known for their visits to Stonehenge at summer solstice, organized a week-long free festival in the countryside. The Avon Free Festival was traditionally a small, informal annual gathering of hippies in caravans. But on this particular year, the event attracted thousands of ravers. Word spread through an answering machine message that said, "Listen up, revelers, it's happening now and for the rest of the weekend. So get yourself out of the house and onto Castle Morton Common. Be there all weekend, hardcore."
By Monday morning, more than 20,000 travellers had turned up. A large marquee had been erected, and the camp became a giant rave party. Loud music echoed across the site, so loud it could be heard 10 miles away. And still more travellers arrived. From the air, the sheer scale of the invasion of the Common can be seen, achieving the dubious record of being Britain's largest ever illegal rave party. And 3 days on, it was showing no signs of coming to an end.
The rave at Castle Morton Common was one of the driving forces behind a crackdown by the UK government in 1993. Parliament introduced the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act, which included a section specifically on raves. The law banned open-air gatherings of 100 or more people who played amplified music described as having a succession of repetitive beats. The law was revised a few years later to drop the number of partiers allowed from 100 people to 20 people, and that remains in place to this day. But even before the crackdown on raves in the UK, a number of DJs decided it was time to leave Britain and bring the rave culture to North America. As it happens, the phenomenon was already spreading around the United States and Canada. It's hard to tell this story in a straight line. The rise of rave culture happened simultaneously in a few locations around North America. Let's start in New York. In 1989, a popular Brooklyn DJ named Frankie Bones went to England and played a party called Energy, going on at 6 a.m. in front of 25,000 people. Inspired, Bones decided to start throwing similar parties in the U.S., parties that he dubbed storm raves, which took place in Brooklyn warehouses. And Frankie Bones was also allegedly the man behind the Plur philosophy, which remains popular at today's EDM festivals. Plur stands for peace, love, unity, and respect, and it seems to have first appeared during a fight at a storm rave in Brooklyn. Bones famously yelled on the microphone, "If you don't start showing some peace, love, and unity, I'll break your faces." He also released a track in June 1993 called Peace, Love, and Unity.
This storm is only gonna rain strong. They can't rain like a snake with a big dawn. So keep moving to the sound of the drum. You can't stop till the rain's done. Rush, bring out the sound system, pump up the bass and make the people listen to something they never heard before. The crowd will leave when the clock hits 9 a.m. The competition spies all party till we watch the sunrise. It's like a volcano eruption, yo. It's a bold production of ravers. Throw your hands in the air, bang your head against a wall like you just don't.
Around the same time, the legendary party producer DJ Scotto organized his first New York rave at the Ritz on West 54th Street, formerly Studio 54. Moby was among the live performers at that event. That same year, 1992, DJ Scotto also started his infamous Friday night parties called NASA at the iconic club Shelter in a rundown part of Tribeca. Actress Chloe Sevigny, a teenager at the time, was a regular at NASA, and she was later featured in a 1995 film about the 90s New York rave culture called Kids. NBC's Today Show ran a segment on the New York rave scene in 1992.
Now, secrecy is key, with locations kept under wraps until hours before the event.
Why is rave kept such a secret?
All right, I'll tell you. It's because the point of it is that it's not a club. It's something that's underground. It's something that you can't find. Part of the excitement is the fact that you guys can't find us.
Scotto's NASA Collective, which stands for Nocturnal Audio and Sensory Awakening, went on to produce rave tours that featured Moby, Prodigy, Orbital, Aphex Twin, and then emerging producer Richie Houghton. Another prominent rave promoter in the 90s was Global Underground Network. They organized the Opium and Narnia festivals in Southern California that drew massive crowds. Narnia was featured on MTV and twice in Life magazine and honored as the event of the year in 1995. The event became known as the Woodstock of Generation X. There were other big events as well. A New Year's Eve rave in 1992 at the California amusement park Knott's Berry Farm attracted over 17,000 people, which at the time set a record as the biggest legal rave in North America. The event was organized by Rave America and had 6 outdoor stages and dance floors among the rides and water slides. The amusement park was overrun by backpack-toting, e-dropping kids, with several thousand more without tickets gathered outside the event hoping to get in. It's been said that event at Knott's Berry Farm put an exclamation point on the arrival of rave culture in the early 90s. Again, some of the parties were legal, while others were illegal. They were secret. So how did word spread? Well, in the early days, it took quite a bit of creativity and legwork. This was still the pre-internet era, so initially, everything was very phone-based. To keep things secret, ravers called a phone line to get directions to a general area where the rave was being held. Exact addresses were usually not given out to try to prevent police from finding the location. It was the same in most big cities where raves were taking place, including Toronto. Scott Fraser, who was a club owner, manager, and entrepreneur in the city's entertainment scene in the 80s and 90s, says they made a big effort to keep things on the down low.
We did all the things that we heard people did over in the UK, which was you went to this hot dog stand and he gave you an address, and you went to this donut shop and they gave you an address, and you went to 6 or 7 places before you found out where the real party was, which was usually around the corner from the hot dog cart. The point is this was supposed to stop the police from finding us, not that the police couldn't go to the hot dog cart or the donut shop. It was just all just this game.
Toronto had one of the biggest rave scenes in North America, with parties featuring house music and ecstasy as early as 1991. The first were organized by a UK outfit called Exodus Productions at 23 Hop, a club that occupied a dark, raw warehouse space with no signage on Richmond Street. Around the same time, DJ Alex arrived in Toronto from London and began hosting chemistry events at a warehouse on River Street, just around the corner from 23 Hop.
It was mind-boggling to me. And you go into this building and it looks like a decrepit, condemned, shut-down warehouse, and all of a sudden there's a sound system and there's lasers and video. It was insane.
What started as a small underground scene of warehouse parties in the downtown core soon blew up.
You know, Toronto was one of the earliest. I mean, in the whole North American scene, Toronto was renowned as being, one of the epicenters in North America.
That's Scott Turner. He and the other Scott you heard from earlier are close friends, who were both heavily involved in the rave scene in the 90s. Scott Turner worked in radio, and during the 90s was program director of dance music station Energy 108. And full disclosure, he was my boss for a couple of years while I worked at the station as a newscaster. Turner says there were lots of clubs playing house music or rave music during this time, but that's not the same thing as a rave.
A rave really to me would be something in a secret location, not already a club that has a sound system that's built in. It's a warehouse or outside where you hire the equipment, you have to bring in the lights, you've got to bring in security. That to me is a proper rave.
People attending these proper raves came armed with a few necessary accessories.
Whistles was a big part of it, and everybody would be blowing the whistles, during the music when they're dancing. The glow sticks was a huge part of the rave scene. A lot of glow sticks. Baggy pants. Everybody had these just enormous baggy pants, and the soothers was a very funny thing. We realized soon that it was part of ecstasy, because what would happen on ecstasy, especially if you had a fair bit, you would start to grind your teeth. And you know what it was? Like, some people were a little more prone to it that had more of the jaw and the teeth grinding than others. So I think wearing or having the soother in your mouth really helped that.
Rave accessories and fashion evolved over time, but there are a couple of essential outfits, according to IEDM, an online rave wear company. In the 80s and early 90s, a rave outfit consisted of a smiley face t-shirt along with oversized pants with a lot of pockets, whistle on a necklace, colorful bucket hat, and sneakers. By the mid to late 90s, the outfits evolved to include hair spiked with colored gel, a visor, glow stick, Mickey Mouse keychain plush, furry backpack, and shell toe Adidas. And by that time, the rave scene in North America was undergoing a big shift. The parties were getting bigger, and the age of the audience was getting younger. What once attracted crowds in their early 20s was now attracting 15 and 16-year-olds. Word of raves was now spreading openly on the internet. And the music was being heavily marketed by record labels. Artists like Prodigy, the Chemical Brothers, Fatboy Slim, and Moby took the industry by storm. As raves continued growing in popularity, word got out to the adults in society that young people were rebelling in a new and dangerous way. In 1997, 2020 ran a segment warning parents about the threats.
They call it a rave, and it's the latest kid craze. Millions of youngsters as young as age 10 flock to secret locations to party and dance through the night. That's all night long, often till 8 or 9 in the morning.
The segment warned that not only were kids staying out all hours and missing school because of it, they were also taking drugs, ecstasy, LSD, and ketamine, and they were engaging in risky and dangerous behavior. It suggested that up to 70% of kids who attended raves were on drugs. Scott Fraser says parents had a right to be worried.
Like, it was 100% legitimate. It was a train that was running so fast out of the station that it was very hard to keep up. The whole scene was drug fueled.
So if you're like me and didn't attend a rave in the 90s, you might be wondering why ecstasy was such a big part of the scene. Well, Scott Turner says it has to do with the music.
If you were to take ecstasy and listen to, AC/DC or some Rolling Stones, it really brings you down. It just doesn't work. But there's something in the frequencies of house music and techno and trance music that it just neurologically does something, and it really takes the music to another level.
The use of ecstasy was so ubiquitous at raves that Turner actually wrote a memo to all staff at Energy 108 in 1992 about an upcoming rave. It included some info about ecstasy, which he explained was a major part of the UK rave scene, and to a much smaller degree, a part of the Toronto scene. Turner included a photocopied page from a report on ecstasy, which described the origins of the drug and its effects. For example, one paragraph states that ecstasy causes widening of the pupils, a faster heartbeat, a faint tingling all over, dry mouth. It can cause eye rolling, dancing on the spot, smoking intensely, sweating, pulling weird faces, and jaw grinding. But raves and acid house music aren't the only genre of music associated with a certain type of drug. Other drugs and genres have also historically been linked together, like jazz and heroin in the 1960s, disco and quaaludes, reggae and weed, punk and speed, rap and cocaine. The list goes on. And part of the reason for that is drugs tend to make music sound better. And I'm not just saying that, there is science behind this. Dr. Zach Walsh, an associate professor at the University of British Columbia's Department of Psychology, has done a ton of research on the subject, and he says there's a bunch of reasons why music sounds better when you're high. But a main one has a lot to do with what is referred to as the locus coeruleus, or the novelty detection part of the brain, and how that responds to both music and drugs. Dr. Walsh told Vice some drugs, especially psychedelic drugs, activate and enhance the part of our brain that detects novelty. So when you hear music on drugs, you have the experience of it being entirely new, like you're hearing it for the very first time, which can be kind of mind-blowing. But like with all drugs, there are dangers associated with MDMA, once called ecstasy, now called Molly. The drug raises body temperatures, and combined with continuous dancing on a jam-packed dance floor, the result can be heat stroke and even death, which is why ravers drank tons of water. And even that can lead to something called water intoxication, which can also be deadly. Plus, long-term use of MDMA can lead to serious health issues like weight loss, fatigue, depression, and can mess with your immune system. And there's always the concern that users can be sold other, more dangerous drugs like heroin instead of MDMA. In October 1999, a 20-year-old university student died at a Toronto rave in an underground garage after taking 3 times the amount of ecstasy that could kill a person. Alan Ho was among 3,500 young people who attended the event called A View to a Thrill. He collapsed on the dance floor in front of a friend. He lay on the concrete, his eyes closed, his jaw and fists clenched. Around him, thousands of young people, unaware, continued to dance to the pulsating beat of techno music in the heat of the soggy underground garage. His friend kept yelling his name, and after a few minutes, a bouncer came over and said, "Take him outside, he's overdosing." Ho died in hospital about 15 hours later. The death of Alan Ho marked a turning point for Toronto's rave scene. He was the 9th person in Ontario to die after taking ecstasy, including a 20-year-old student named Kieran Kelly, who died at a 3-day rave at Sauble Beach, and another 20-year-old man who overdosed at a party at the Warehouse Club in Toronto. According to a doctor with the Toronto Public Health Board, people were overdosing every weekend at raves. Dozens were also getting arrested, charged with drug offenses, including at a popular event held several times a year on the grounds of Exhibition Place, which is a city-owned venue. Concern over raves and ecstasy reached a fever pitch with calls to shut them down. Scott Fraser wasn't that surprised when things started to go wrong.
Didn't take a rocket scientist to realize that this was a situation that was prone for something bad to happen eventually. You had people on drugs making decisions about people on drugs. The two just, as a thought looking back at it now, just doesn't make any sense.
In response, the City of Toronto placed a 2-month moratorium on raves at city-owned venues like Exhibition Place, and a coroner's inquest was called into the death of Alan Ho. At the inquest, a toxicology expert testified that a single ecstasy pill can kill someone with a sensitivity to MDMA. Dr. Margaret Thompson said she believed Ho had such a sensitivity. Jurors at the inquest were asked to consider whether governments should permanently ban raves, but in the end they said that would just push them further underground and make them more dangerous. So instead, the jury recommended that police and city officials should license raves, which would force organizers to follow safety protocols. The jury also suggested a minimum age of 16 to attend a rave, and it also stressed the need for governments to better educate young people about the risks of ecstasy and other drugs commonly used at the events. Then Toronto Mayor Mel Lastman, along with Toronto Police Chief Julian Fantino, both continued to push for a harsher response. Rather than implementing the recommendations that came out of the Alan Ho inquest, Mayor Lastman put forward a complete ban on raves on city property, as well as a citywide ban on all electronic music events after 3 a.m. In response, a loose collective of promoters, harm reduction advocates, and activists called the Toronto Dance Safety Committee organized a massive protest party outside City Hall. The event called iDance took place on August 1st, 2000, attracting 20,000 rave supporters. The lineup for the event included international house DJs Derek Carter, Miss Honey Dijon, and Bad Boy Bill. They also booked local heroes Kenny Glasgow and Dr. Trance, and suspended a giant disco ball over Nathan Phillips Square. The next day, city councillors rejected the rave ban by a massive margin of 50-4. But even though raves came out on top in this battle, the scene was undergoing another massive shift. Toronto raves of the early 90s no longer existed, really. The edgy, underground grassroots gatherings had become big electronic dance music events run by big-time promoters. Those promoters were dealing with increased regulations that cut into profits, venues were getting harder to find, plus rental fees were going up as venue owners were cluing in on how much money some raves were making. And according to a Vice article, the scene had splintered into many different factions, many of whom didn't even want to be associated with the word rave anymore. It was the same across North America. Clubs were moving to smaller premises, and weekly events became monthly events. In California, which had always been America's rave stronghold, large-scale parties all but disappeared. By 2004-2005, some North American DJs were moving to Berlin, where the work prospects were better. Over the next several years, a rebranding of electronic dance music and the parties associated with them began to take place. What were once called raves became festivals. Techno became EDM. And even the drugs were rebranded. Ecstasy became Molly, which is just ecstasy in powder form as opposed to pills. During the second half of the 2000s, electronic dance music began to surge in popularity again. Daft Punk's set at the Coachella Festival in 2006, where they performed inside a huge glowing pyramid, is often called a turning point. Another big breakthrough came with the 2010 Electric Daisy Carnival held at the LA Memorial Coliseum, which attracted over 200,000 people over 2 days. And that was followed by a number of other EDM festivals and a commercial surge for DJs like Avicii, Deadmau5, and Skrillex. In the past year, during COVID lockdowns, illegal raves have been taking place again in the UK, France, Berlin, and other European cities. With clubs shut down and festivals canceled, partiers have once again returned to secret warehouse locations and isolated farmers' fields to dance in secret. Thanks for listening to this exploration of 90s rave culture from Ibiza to Toronto. And thanks to my very special guests, the two Scots, Scott Turner and Scott Fraser. Their knowledge of the rave scene was greatly appreciated. This topic was actually suggested by a few of our listeners, Ali, Chris, and Jarrett. A great idea, guys. Thanks so much for pointing me in this direction. If you have an idea, please let me know. You can reach me through Twitter and Facebook at 1990s History and on Instagram at That 90s Podcast. You can also email me at 90s@curiouscast.ca. History of the 90s is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, and everywhere else you get your streaming audio. You can also listen at curiouscast.ca. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode. And while you're there, take a minute to rate and review us. This episode was written and hosted by me, Kathy Kinzora. Our producer is Dila Velasquez, and sound design and final production is by Rob Johnston. See you next time for more History of the 90s. On the morning of November 8, 1994, a 57-year-old doctor sat down for breakfast in his Vancouver home. The outspoken obstetrician had been performing abortions for over 20 years, and during that time, he'd been the target of anti-abortion protesters, who on occasion set up peaceful pickets outside his home and his office. But today would be different. As the doctor ate his breakfast, a sniper's bullet smashed through the glass doors of the kitchen. It tore into his left thigh, shattering the bone and severing his femoral artery. The doctor fell to the floor as blood poured from his wound. He was gravely injured, but somehow he had the wherewithal to use the belt from his bathrobe as a tourniquet, saving his own life. Over the next 4 years, an unknown sniper carried out a reign of terror in Canada and the U.S., targeting abortion providers on both sides of the border, leading investigators on a global manhunt. I'm Kathy Kinzora, and this is History of the 90s. On this episode, we look back at the violent era that gave rise to a man known as the abortion sniper. I'm probably stating the obvious when I say the issue of abortion is complicated and highly contentious. In this episode, we're not going to try to tackle the whole issue. Instead, we're going to focus on one facet in particular: a rise in violence against abortion providers and clinics in the 90s that included attacks by a mysterious gunman. But before we do that, a little bit of background. The practice of abortion was legalized in the United States following the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973. In Canada, it was first allowed in 1969, but only under certain circumstances. Then, in 1988, abortions became fully legal in Canada when the Supreme Court struck down the country's abortion law as unconstitutional. In both countries, as soon as abortion became legal, protests were a frequent occurrence. And in the US, there were some cases of violence reported back in the 70s and 80s, mostly arsons and a few bombings at abortion clinics. But the situation ratcheted up dramatically in the 1990s. As the number of abortions being performed in the United States climbed from 500,000 in 1973, the year it was legalized, to 1.4 million in 1990, more and more anti-abortion extremists began to turn to violence. Particularly those aligned with an extremist group called the Army of God. They made their position clear that killing abortion providers was the only way to stop the procedure from being performed. A manual published by the Army of God stated, "Our Lord requires that whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Not out of hatred for you, but out of the love for the persons you exterminate. We are forced to take up arms against you." Another movement called Operation Rescue was also very active in the 90s. The Christian-based group formed by Terry Randall in 1986 believed that violence was a justified way to prevent what it called the murder of unborn children. They frequently protested outside clinics and often incited violence against people who worked there. And according to a New York Times article in 1998, an anti-abortion internet website called the Nuremberg Files kept track of doctors who performed the procedure. The website stated that a coalition of concerned citizens was collecting dossiers on abortionists for future trials on crimes against humanity. The website listed the names of hundreds of doctors across the US and Canada who it said performed abortions. In addition to the list, the website included the abortion provider's personal information, things like their home addresses, phone numbers, and photographs. The names of the doctors were color-coded to indicate whether the doctor was working or wounded. And if there was a line crossed through the doctor's name, it meant they'd been killed. In 1993, Dr. David Gunn became the first doctor in the United States to be killed by an anti-abortion extremist when he was shot outside a clinic in Pensacola, Florida. Just before his death, an old-fashioned wanted poster of Gunn was handed out at a rally for Operation Rescue. The poster included a picture of Gunn, his home phone number, and some other identifying information. Later that same year, another doctor was shot and injured outside a clinic in Wichita, Kansas. And then in July 1994, a doctor and his volunteer security guard were gunned down outside the Pensacola clinic where the first shooting took place a year and a half earlier. A well-known protester with ties to the Army of God was arrested at the scene for that one. Bombings and arsons at clinics in the United States also became almost commonplace, with over 40 reported attacks between 1990 and 1994. And anti-abortion extremists also began using butyric acid as a weapon against abortion facilities in about early 1992. The colorless liquid was injected into dozens of buildings, producing a putrid smell that's been described as being similar to vomit. The tactic not only caused clinics to shut down for a while, it also caused thousands of dollars of damage, because carpet and furniture often needed to be replaced. In May 1992, Canada, which had escaped the anti-abortion violence so far, was suddenly no longer a